Thank you for joining us on this class on Python while loops. In this class, we're going to look at what while loops are, how to use them, when to use them, how they differ from for loops. We'll look at the break, continue, pass, and else clauses. And finally, we'll end with an example of using while loops with user input. What are you waiting for? Let's go to the next slide. Python's while statement is a general iteration construct, and by the word iterate, we mean to perform repeatedly. It repeatedly executes a block of code as long as the while loop's header is true. Control continues to loop back to the start until the while loop header is no longer true. When the test in the header becomes false, control passes to the code that appears after the while loop. And here we explore the while loop's basic format. We'll look at the red ball first. While true. This is the while loop's test, also known as the while loop header. Then we have the body of the while loop, these execute statements, the ball in blue. Then we have an optional else clause, and this doesn't work like else clause when we are dealing with if statements or branching. This is a little different, and we're going to go through that. This else clause will only run if the loop did not exit previously with a break statement in the body of the while loop itself. So two things to note. If the while loop test never evaluates to true, the body will never execute. That means it'll never be entered to begin with. And this notion of an infinite loop. Once the while loop body is executing, if the while loop test never evaluates to false, the loop will run indefinitely until you stop it with a Control-C. So keep that in mind and keep it handy. When we say while true, this can be confusing to some. It's just like saying while one. Those things in Python that evaluate to true or that evaluate to false comes to mind. And in Python, one will always evaluate to true. So something else has to happen for this code to not execute indefinitely. And we're going to see what those circumstances will be and how we'll navigate those waters. Here we have two examples of a while loop. Let's look at the first one up in the upper left-hand corner. Code example number 1. A equals 0, B equals 5. Okay, so two integers set. While A is less than B, A should increment by 1, and then we'll print out A. Then we have the optional else clause. It says, does the else print? Yes, it does, because it never hits a break. Now, what happens in this particular snippet of code? Well, if we look at the output, what happens is the numbers 1 through 5 print, and then it goes right on to the else clause. Remember I said it's not like it is in if. In branching, we either execute one branch or the other. It's either the if, the elif, or the else. That's not how it happens here. The else will always execute for a while loop unless we hit a break. That's the definition, so always go back to that. So what happens here is we go through the first time, it's 0, it adds 1 to it, it prints it out. We go through a second time, it becomes 2, it prints it out. We go through the third time, it becomes 3, etc. Now, how is it that this loop ends? The last time the loop runs through its body, A is 4, and 4 plus 1 equals 5. So the header evaluates for truth with, is 5 less than 5? The answer is no. So the interpreter jumps to the else clause at that point, and then we get the, does the else print? Yes, it does, because it never hit a break. Those two print statements print out. That's how that works. Now let's look at code number 2. Now we're going to use the break. Same code, only I have a break statement in the body of the while right after the print A. So you see what gets printed out is just the number 1, and then it doesn't go to the else clause. It goes right to the print statement that's outside of our loop, and it says, I am the first piece of code outside the while loop. I thought you'd never get to me. So notice we introduced the break statement here. The break instructs to jump out of the closest and closing loop and exit the loop entirely. So it prints the first value for A, and then it breaks out. And this print statement here is outside the loop, so it gets executed as the very next thing. So here we'll look at other while loop statements. So we already talked about the break. This causes an immediate exit of the loop and moves on to the code outside of the loop, if there is any. Now the continue. Continue leaves the loop and proceeds to its header statement, so it goes back to the top of our loop. Pass is just an empty placeholder. So let's look at this code example that uses continue. We want to parse out just the odd numbers. Let's go through it. X equals 10, so we have an integer set 10 to variable x. We have a counter set to 0, and then we have odds, an empty list. So while x equals x minus 1, count equals count plus 1. So x will decrement and count will increment. Then we have an if statement. If x mod 2 equals 2. So if it's an even number, continue. If it's not an even number, that is it's not divisible by 2, we'll then append x to our empty list odds, which won't be empty for long. And then it prints out which iteration, the count, wherever count is in its increment, and then the literal odd number and whatever x is. When we're all done, it's going to go to that print statement at the bottom outside of the loop, and it'll print, here are all the odds numbers, right? Meaning the numbers from the list odds, and print odds. So what's happening here? What is the function of this continue if you haven't figured it out already? This acts like a gatekeeper. If the number is divisible by 2, meaning x mod 2, it would be even. And it would say, get out of here. We don't want you. We only want odd numbers. So it sends it back to the top where it gets evaluated one more time, and it gets decremented, and then it tests again. If it's not divisible by 2, then it would be odd, and that's what we want. Then it lets it go to be printed and appended. So it only lets it pass through. That's why I'm calling it a gatekeeper in this case. It only lets it pass through if it's an odd number. Yeah, but you may be thinking now, but what makes it end? What is it testing for? Again, the test is the header, while x. Think about this. X is 10. In the body of the loop, every time it loops, x is decremented. So at some certain point, x will evaluate to 0, right? And when it does that, while x being 0, 0 is falsy in Python, right? It's not true. So at that point, while x, when x is 0, it becomes false. Loop is over. It's at that point that it prints that last print statement at the bottom outside of the loop. And finally, let's talk about when to use the while loop, under what conditions. The while loop runs until a defined condition is met. We've proven that through our examples thus far. This is unlike the for loop that will usually run for a finite number of times. Say, for example, when you're using it with the range method and you set the range to 10. So the ideal use case of a while loop is when getting input from a user, as we have no idea what they will do or how long it's going to take them to do it. So we have an example here to the left. We set a magic number in our heads to be 6, and so in the code as well, while true. Right, so we know this loop, if nothing else happens, if we don't have something in the code, if it's set while true, it's going to go on forever. So we have to do something in the code to make sure that doesn't happen, because we'll have an infinite loop, and that's generally not desirable. So we have a variable in the body of the while loop, user underscore guess. And we set that to an integer and ask them for input. Guess a number between 1 and 10. If user guess is less than 6, in our first branch of the if statement, we'll print, sorry, that number is too low, try again. And the elif, we do the same, but except it's greater than 6, and we say, sorry, that number is too high, try again. Then we have our else branch, print, you guessed right, the magic number is 6, and then we have a break. And then outside the body of the loop, we print game over. So you see the output in this particular case, and again, it could go on and on and on and on, even though we're giving the user hints based on how they responded to a number being too high or too low. You think eventually they'll get 6, it's only 10 digits. But you see here in this particular user, they guessed 2, then 4, then 8, then 7, and finally 6, and when they did, it jumps down to the else branch of the if statement, says you guessed right, the magic number is 6, game over. And then we have a break. In this case, the code keeps running until the user guesses the magic number. At that point, it travels to the else branch of the if statement and hits the break. And then once it hits the break, it jumps out of the loop. Without the break, the while header will always evaluate to true and continue to loop indefinitely. So we must have that break here to make this work. But this is a perfect example of when you'd want to use a while loop. This is while looping at its very best.